Hey, what's up? I'm Jay Maas with Reverb.com, and in today's video, I'm going to give you 5 great reasons to incorporate analog gear into your recording setup. Okay, so really quickly before we get started, I know this has been covered a million times, so we're going to make it brief. What's the difference between analog and digital? So to super simplify this, essentially analog is a smooth wave that travels through some kind of cable, is recorded onto some sort of physical medium, and does not involve a computer. It does not involve converters. An analog signal can be generated a couple different ways. A really common way is with a microphone recording any type of vibration. So this microphone happens to be a Royer 121, and essentially what happens is when sounds are near it or in front of it or whatever, there's a component inside this microphone that we call the capsule. This one so happens to have a ribbon, some have a round capsule, but it vibrates. And when it vibrates, it sends signal through a cable. That cable will take the sound somewhere, either to a mic pre or to a tape machine, and it needs to get recorded some way, somehow. In the old days, that was tape machines. Nowadays, that almost never happens, and it's almost always through some converters and into a DAW. Another really common way to generate an analog signal would be with a guitar. It flows through the pickup, into a cable, over to an amp, out of a speaker, and then probably you'll record it with a microphone. So essentially what an analog signal is it's just a representation of a vibration that occurred in real time into something that is able to capture that vibration. That's really it. So that brings us to, then what's digital? So a digital signal is essentially a snapshot or a series of snapshots of that curve. The way we get an analog signal into our recording software is we use converters. Converters basically receive the analog signal and it takes a bunch of little snapshots. And essentially it rebuilds that curve with all these little bricks. It's very complicated. We don't have to get into it, but you can think of it like this. An analog signal is a smooth roller coaster, and a digital signal is sort of like if you tried to build that roller coaster out of Mario blocks. So as computers have gotten faster and hard drive space has gotten cheaper, we've been able to take more snapshots of that analog curve, thus resulting in a smoother curve. However, nothing is ever going to be as smooth as the original. It doesn't matter how many little blocks you use to represent what should be a smooth curve, it will never be as smooth as the original signal. So even though we can make those blocks smaller and smaller and smaller, no matter how small you make those blocks, it will never be as smooth as the original curve. And where we see the most significant advantages when things are still in the analog domain, it's gonna be in the high end and in distortion. It's just smoother. Okay, so now that we've talked about the differences between an analog signal and a digital signal, you're probably thinking, okay, cool, but I'm not gonna go buy a tape machine, I'm not gonna go buy a console, and nobody expects you to. That's just not realistic anymore. So even though basically all of us are gonna use digital recording software, we're going to hit converters and we're gonna edit, and it's convenient, and there's a million benefits I could go on forever about when it comes to the digital side of recording. Before we convert, before we take our analog wave and turns it into ones and zeros, we have an opportunity to play with that analog signal. So with no further ado, I'm gonna give you my 5 analog pros that I lean on every day and I think make a huge impact on my recordings over not having an analog side at all. All right, number 1, distortion and harmonics. I love the way that analog gear sounds when you push it just a little bit. See, unlike in the digital domain where clipping is really bad and the artifacts you get from clipping are just totally not pleasant, in the analog domain, it can be used to your advantage. It can totally make a boring bass DI have a little bit more life, or maybe the vocalist sounds a little bit more aggressive just because you push it a little bit. So number 1, distortion and harmonics. All right, number 2, speaking of pushing, analog gear just sounds better at extreme settings. I'm far more comfortable pushing 12 dB on an EQ in the analog domain than I am in the digital domain. So while plugins are definitely getting better, they still sort of have a tendency to not sound as great when you push them to high settings. For that reason, when it comes to extreme settings, I go analog every time. All right, number 3, no latency. This really can't be overstated. Think about it. An artist comes to record at your studio or you're recording yourself. They want to be able to hear themselves in real time. Any amount of latency is going to be distracting to the artist. It fundamentally undermines the essence of the performance. I always like my artists to be in as low latency of a situation as possible, and hopefully with 0 latency whatsoever. The last thing you want is any distractions when you're recording someone who's worked so hard on their art, worked so hard on their songs, and they're coming in to like give it all, and then the last thing they want is that little micro delay that makes them feel less confident. So for that reason, no latency is huge. All right, number 4, and I love this one. And this is something that I don't think people think about all the time, but when you're using analog gear, you're more mixing with your ears than you are your eyes. A graphical parametric EQ is really cool, and it's something that I use every day. However, there's definitely something to be said with having a closer, more one-to-one relationship with the end listener. If all you can do is hear the changes while you're mixing, that's all that's going to translate to the listener anyway. So think about it. Your end listener isn't going to be looking at a screen when they're listening to the song. They're just going to be listening. And when you're using analog gear, you have a much closer relationship to that end listener. You're just using their ears and they're just experiencing it with their ears. While a graphical parametric EQ is awesome and really handy, there's definitely something to be said with maintaining a closer relationship between you and the listener. All right, and number 5, and I promise this isn't a cop-out, using analog gear is fun. And if you're having fun, you're probably doing more work. I know it might sound crazy to all the new school kids who just work in the box, but when I get my hands on gear and I start to make choices, I make those choices differently. There's just something about it. Again, it's more using your ears. I'm having a better time. And when I'm having a better time, I really believe that I make better mixes. And I think if you're having a better time, you'll probably make better mixes too. All right, so now that we know what it is and why I like it, let's talk about 5 pieces that I can't live without. Pieces I use every single day and I would recommend to anyone. The first piece of gear that your signal's gonna hit after the microphone is more than likely gonna be a mic pre. Everyone's got a lot of opinions on this. I do too. My favorite mic pre is the Great River ME-INV. It's based off an old Neve 1073 mic pre, and I think it's amazing. What I like about this mic pre is that to me, it adds the perfect amount of texture and you can almost drive it like a tube amp. It's got an input gain and an output trim. This means you can push it and get some of that grit and some of that exciting analog distortion, sonically pleasing analog distortion, and still trim back the level so it's not too hot coming into your converters. Pro tip for me, I like to just be tickling that yellow light on most sources. It adds just a little bit of natural compression and adds some excitement in the harmonics. Try it out.
If you're on a little bit of a tighter budget, I also really recommend this Focusrite ISA1 mic pre. It's super solid, it has variable impedance, so it matches with different microphone types really well. It's also really fun to experiment with. And while it's not uncommon for mic preamps to have a direct in for a guitar or a bass, this one actually has a pass-through, so you can record a direct signal in and send a signal to the amp at the same time so that you can record both. That's actually super handy, especially with modern recording techniques.
All right, number 2 is a compressor. Every studio needs at least one. I built my career on this compressor. Distressors, the Empirical Labs Distressor. So the Distressor is just what it sounds like. It's a compressor with distortion. Distressor is distortion compressor, essentially. It has a couple different distortion modes. They all sound really good, and you kind of can't make it sound bad. Sometimes if I'm doing a heavier project or I want to get really extreme with something, I will put it on distortion 3 and crank it. It sounds so gnarly, so exciting, and so cool. But sometimes, if I just want to add a little bit of warmth, I want to warm up a track that's been clearly just recorded in the digital domain, I'll put it on distortion 2, and it just sort of adds those like tape harmonics. It sounds rounder and warmer and just kind of more finished. It's kind of like cheating. I can't recommend it enough. Number 3, any style of VARI-MU compressor. Admittedly, they're kind of expensive, and the most famous of the VARI-MU compressors is probably the Manley, but NIF makes an awesome VARI-MU compressor. IGS makes an awesome VARI-MU compressor. Essentially, what a VARI-MU compressor does is it compresses with tubes, like the type of tubes you'd find in a guitar amp or something like that. So while with the Distressor, I'll totally crank it and I'll do a ton of compression and love it. With the VARI-MU compressor, I usually use it on bus work, the drum bus, or they sound great on vocals, but I use it on the stereo bus all the time. I think if there's one sound that just still has not been replicated in the digital domain nearly as well, it's going to be VARI-MU compression. Tubes are so harmonically rich. They often add a sheen and a color that is really, really nice, and you just kind of can't do it in the box. I've tried, trust me. While it might not be the first piece of analog gear I would get, it's definitely on my short list, and if you can afford one, definitely grab one. All right, number 4, it's gonna be the API 550 series. You can get the 550A or the 550V. You will find people on message boards yelling at each other about which one's better and why, but they're both awesome. Sorry, message board people, they are, and you kind of can't lose with them. This is another piece of gear that's kind of hard to make sound bad. I typically find myself using it most when I'm tracking individual guitars, bass, vocals, drums, whatever. I do use it on the master bus sometimes, but because the gain is stepped in minimum of 2 dB increments, that is of course unless you go with the API 5500, which can do smaller increments, I find it just really good for tracking. A perfect example of this is sweetening up a guitar tone or maybe adding a nice crack to a snare drum. I like the fact that you're making coarse decisions with it, and it sounds great. Also, there's a lot of great emulations of the API 550 series. My favorite probably being the UAD version, but if you're not in the UAD ecosystem, check out the one from Slate. It's super affordable and it sounds awesome. Okay, number 5 desert island analog gear for me is going to be a PULTEC style EQ. There's a bunch of different variations of PULTEC style EQs out there. Warm Audio makes one that's actually pretty affordable. You can go all the way up to the TubeTech ones. They're more money. They sound great too. So just like the VARI-MU was a tube compressor, these PULTECs are tube EQs. That means they have some sonic similarities. I use them for sheen and I use them for depth. The low end on a PULTEC EQ kind of can't be beat. You can boost and cut at the same frequencies, which gives you some really interesting low end curves, a lot of sonic weight. And then up at the top end, because it's a tube EQ, it just does this really beautiful shimmery thing that makes your track sound way more professional. Okay, so what would my recommendations be if you were trying to implement some analog gear into your recording setup? I would say start with a great preamp. You could go Great River, you could go API, you could go Shadow Hills, you could go La Chapelle. These are all awesome companies who only make quality stuff. After that, I think I would grab an Empirical Labs Distressor or an 1176 or an 1176 clone. These are both classic. If I had to pick, personally, I'd pick Distressor, but they're both amazing. I think once you've spiced up your signal with a nice mic pre, and you've controlled your dynamics with a great compressor, now you can start adding some EQ. Again, while I love the API stuff, you could grab a Purple ODD. They're a little bit more affordable and they sound really great. That's an inductor-based EQ. If you have a little bit more money to spend, you could go with like a Chandler curve bender. Those are incredible. Then after that, I might start adding things that are good for bus work, like a PULTEC or like a VARI-MU. But I definitely think getting a nice mic pre, a nice compressor, and a nice EQ so you can enhance your signal before you ever convert to digital really can't be overstated. With that, I'm gonna go. Everybody have a nice day. I'm Jay Maas from Reverb.com. Happy mixing.